Now, Beverly's very excited, even though she's not been invited to the birthday party of Her Royal Highness Princess Charlotte. She is, of course, third in line to the throne. She is, of course, the daughter of the Prince and Princess of Wales.
Look, it's nice. It's a 9-year-old girl who's having a birthday. Royal fams from around the globe.
Imagine my old mate Kevin Maguire saying, 9-year-old girl has birthday.
Let's talk about where the speculation is actually coming from, because it isn't coming from nowhere. Multiple royal reports over the past several months have pointed to two very different, very specific titles being floated for Charlotte's future. And understanding both of them is the key to understanding why this whole conversation is more complicated and more genuinely interesting than a single clean headline could ever capture. Because here's what makes this different from the usual royal noise cycle. This isn't a rumor about a scandal. It isn't gossip about a rift. It's something quieter and, in a strange way, more revealing. A genuine institutional puzzle sitting at the center of the modern British monarchy, involving a title currently worn by one woman, a title waiting in reserve for another, and an 11-year-old girl who is, whether she likes it or not, the answer to a question the royal family hasn't had to seriously ask in decades. Before we go further, a moment of honesty, because you deserve that more than you deserve another breathless thumbnail. Nothing here has been confirmed by Buckingham Palace or Kensington Palace. No announcement has been made. What we have is reporting, credible, sourced, multiple outlets converging on the same threads, about what senior royals and royal commentators believe is likely, and why. That distinction matters, and we're going to hold on to it the entire way through, because so much of what circulates about this family blurs the line between reported and confirmed, until nobody can tell the difference anymore. We're not doing that here. So if you're the kind of person who wants the real shape of a story instead of a recycled thumbnail promising a shocking twist that never actually happened, this is where you stay. And if that's useful to you, now's a good time to subscribe, because the actual confirmation, whenever it comes, is going to get buried under 100 fabricated versions within hours of it happening. Being here first, from a source that draws the line between fact and speculation, is going to matter more than it sounds like it does right now. Here's where things actually stand. Princess Charlotte Elizabeth Diana was born in May 2015, the second child and only daughter of Prince William and Catherine, then Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, now Prince and Princess of Wales. She arrived as fourth in line to the throne, behind her grandfather, her father, and her older brother, Prince George. She has never been destined to be queen in her own right. That was never the question, and it still isn't. Her brother remains the heir.
Kensington Palace released the photograph in the last hour on their social media channels. It was taken by the Princess of Wales, Princess Charlotte's mother, in the grounds of Windsor Castle in the last couple of days, and it is a very modern way that they released it. Again, similar to Prince Louis last week, they released it on social media channels first, thanking the public directly for their kind messages.
That part of the story hasn't changed, and isn't going to change in anything we're about to discuss. What has changed is something subtler. The question of what role, what title, and what public identity Charlotte will carry as a grown woman, sister to a reigning king, inside a modern monarchy that is being forced to think harder than it has in generations about what its women are actually for. That's the real hook here, and it's worth sitting with, because it's not really about Charlotte at 11 years old. It's about an institution quietly trying to write a job description it has barely ever needed before. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Most of what gets discussed about the British monarchy in public is either about the person destined to wear the crown, or about a scandal, or about a wedding. Rarely does the conversation settle on something this procedural, the quiet architecture of who gets called what and why, decades before it takes effect. But that quiet architecture is exactly where a monarchy's actual values show up. Not in the coronation, not in the wedding photographs. In the small, deliberate choices about how much formal recognition to give the children who will never be king or queen themselves, but who will spend their entire adult lives standing next to the one who is. The first is the title of Duchess of Edinburgh. Right now, that title belongs to Sophie, the wife of Prince Edward, King Charles's younger brother. Sophie has held it since 2023, when Edward was made Duke of Edinburgh, a title with its own layered history, since it was originally created for Prince Philip and only formally passed to Edward after the late Queen's death.
It's been the most remarkable journey to have gone from that home counties girl, Kate Middleton, to falling in love with the prince and to become someone who is, I would say undoubtedly now, the most important woman, most influential woman in the royal family.
According to reports, King Charles has floated the idea of eventually reserving the Duchess of Edinburgh title for Charlotte, once it becomes available again. That's a significant idea, because it means Charles is already thinking, years in advance, about how to fold his granddaughter into the highest tier of working royal titles, not as an afterthought, but as something worth planning around now, while she's still a child. But, and this is where the story gets its first real complication, the same reporting suggests something else alongside it, that Charlotte's younger brother, Prince Louis, might miss out on a title that would traditionally go to a monarch's second son. That's not a small detail. For centuries, the pattern in the British monarchy has been fairly predictable. The heir gets one set of titles, and the next child in line typically inherits a specific, traditional one tied to the royal dukedoms. If Louis is quietly being written out of that old pattern while his sister is being written into an entirely different one, that's not just a footnote about one boy's future title. That's a sign the whole architecture of how this generation gets titled is being reconsidered, sibling by sibling, from the top down. Sit with that for a second, because it's the kind of detail that tends to get lost in the noise. This isn't just, Charlotte might get a fancy new name someday. It's, the family may be redesigning who gets what and why, in a way that doesn't follow the old rulebook. And if that's true, it raises a question no single article seems to fully answer. What does it mean for George, watching his sister possibly positioned for a prestigious historic title, and his younger brother possibly positioned for less than what tradition would normally hand him? Nobody in the current reporting has an answer to that yet. That's the first real, unresolved thread in this story. Not manufactured drama, just an open question sitting right there in the source material. It also helps to understand exactly how the Duke of Edinburgh title actually works, because the mechanics explain why Charlotte specifically has become part of this conversation at all. The title was created back in 1947 for Prince Philip, on his marriage to the then Princess Elizabeth, and he held it for more than 70 years, until his death in 2021. Under royal convention, a title held by someone who later becomes monarch is said to merge with the crown and effectively cease to exist as a separate title, which is exactly what happened when Charles, having inherited it briefly from his father, became king himself in September 2022. That merger is precisely what freed the title up to be recreated for someone new. 6 months into his reign, Charles did just that, formally re-granting the Dukedom of Edinburgh to Prince Edward on his 59th birthday, fulfilling an arrangement the family had apparently agreed on decades earlier, back when Edward and Sophie first married in 1999. Sophie became Duchess of Edinburgh as part of that same 2023 announcement. Here's the detail that matters most for Charlotte's story specifically. Buckingham Palace stated plainly, at the time, that the title will not pass down to Edward and Sophie's own son, James, when Edward eventually dies. Instead, it will once again revert to the crown, at which point it becomes available to be recreated for someone else entirely. Exactly the same mechanism that freed it up for Edward in the first place. That's the actual structural opening reportedly being discussed for Charlotte.
I think when we first started it, it started as a very small idea with Harry and I scratching our heads going, how can we do something that's going to help us in the future? How are we going to build something that's going to provide almost a vehicle to allow us to impact in charitable areas? Because it was quite difficult at the time. Harry and I used to go to a lot of engagements and see these incredible charities doing really great work.
It isn't a matter of anyone taking the title away from Sophie or from James. It's a title that was always going to become available again, eventually, by design. And the question now being floated is simply who the next monarch chooses to give it to when that day comes. Now here's the second title in play, and it's the one most royal watchers have their eye on for the long term, because it's rarer, older, and carries an entirely different kind of weight. Princess Royal. If you're not familiar with it, here's the shorthand. Princess Royal is not automatically inherited. It isn't passed down like a surname. It's a personal, honorary title a reigning monarch can choose to bestow on his or her eldest daughter. And only one person can hold it at any given time, in the entire monarchy, no exceptions. It's considered the single highest honor a female member of the royal family can receive. And in nearly 400 years of English and British royal history, it has only ever been given out 7 times. That number is worth pausing on, because it puts the rarity in real perspective. The first was Mary Stuart, eldest daughter of King Charles I, given the title in 1642, created deliberately as an English answer to the French court's tradition of styling the king's eldest daughter, Madame Royale. Mary went on to marry into the House of Orange and become the mother of the future King William III. After her came a long gap before the next holder, and across the centuries that followed, only a handful of royal daughters ever received it. Princess Charlotte, daughter of King George III, who became Princess Royal in the 1790s, before marrying into European royalty. Princess Victoria, the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria herself, who went on to become German Empress. Princess Louise, daughter of King Edward VII, and Princess Mary, daughter of King George V, who held the title through most of the 20th century. Here's the detail that tends to surprise people the most, and it's a genuinely useful one for understanding why Charlotte's situation is so uncertain. Queen Elizabeth II herself never became Princess Royal. Not because she wasn't the eldest daughter of a king, she was, but because her aunt, Princess Mary, was still alive and still holding the title throughout the entirety of her father's reign. The title simply wasn't available. It stayed with Mary until Mary's death in 1965, more than a decade after Elizabeth had already become queen. By then, Elizabeth herself was the monarch, and Princess Royal is only ever handed down to a monarch's daughter. So the title moved instead to Elizabeth's own daughter, Princess Anne, though it wouldn't actually be bestowed on Anne until 1987, more than 20 years later, once Elizabeth felt the moment and the record of service were right. That's not an obscure historical footnote. That's the exact same structural bottleneck sitting in front of Charlotte right now, playing out for a second time in living memory. Anne currently holds the title, and by tradition, it will remain hers for as long as she lives, regardless of who becomes monarch in the meantime. Which means Charlotte's path to becoming the 8th Princess Royal in nearly 400 years of English history depends on a sequence of events that has nothing to do with ambition, or planning, or even William's own wishes as a future king. It depends on how long her great-aunt is here to hold the title she's spent almost 40 years defining. It's a strange kind of historical echo, when you think about it. A title created in the 1640s, meant to mirror the French court's way of distinguishing a king's eldest daughter, has now bottlenecked twice in a row across only 3 generations of the same family, once around Queen Elizabeth, and quite possibly once around her great-great-granddaughter.
Our future king came from a broken marriage. That's just a fact. And that bonds him to so many others in the country whose parents' marriages have collapsed, and in his case, it was very acrimonious. His parents did their utmost to try to protect their sons from the fallout of that.
400 years of history, and only 7 women have ever worn it, largely because of exactly this kind of timing problem repeating itself. Let that sit for a moment, because it reframes the entire story. This was never really a question of whether the palace wants to give Charlotte a major title. Reporting suggests they do. It's a question of a title that simply cannot exist twice at once, currently belonging to a woman who shows no sign of slowing down her public duties, and a granddaughter who, even in the most straightforward version of events, may be waiting decades rather than years. Now, if you're starting to feel invested in how this eventually resolves, and if you want to actually see it happen, instead of scrolling past a dozen fabricated, breaking thumbnails claiming it already has. This is a good moment to hit subscribe. Not because we're asking nicely, because the actual moment this gets confirmed is going to be a single, quiet Kensington Palace statement, easy to miss, surrounded by wall-to-wall noise, pretending to be that statement years before it's real. Being subscribed here means you get the version grounded in what's actually verified, not the version built to get you to click and then forgotten by tomorrow. And to be clear about just how long a wait this might genuinely be, Anne was 70 years old as of the most recent reporting on her public duties, and shows no signs of scaling back the punishing schedule of engagements she's kept up for decades. Sophie, meanwhile, is still in the relatively early years of holding the Edinburgh title herself. Depending on how events unfold, Charlotte's path to either title could plausibly stretch well beyond her 20s into her 30s or further, which is worth remembering every time a headline implies this is imminent. It isn't. It's a long game, and understanding that is part of understanding the story honestly. It's worth noting, too, what Sophie and Edward have actually done with the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh title since receiving it, because it helps explain why the palace might see real value in keeping this particular title alive within the family, rather than letting it quietly disappear. Buckingham Palace framed the 2023 re-granting explicitly around continuing Prince Philip's legacy. In particular, his work with young people through the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, a youth achievement program he founded in 1956 that has since spread to dozens of countries. Edward had already spent years as a trustee and chairman connected to that program before formally receiving the title, and the couple's very first public outing under their new names was tied directly to it. If the palace is indeed thinking about eventually passing that same title to Charlotte, it isn't hard to imagine the same logic applying again, a title used to carry forward a specific legacy of youth-focused public service, handed to a family member, seen as capable of carrying that legacy well into the middle of the century. Let's talk about the third layer of this, because it's the part that actually determines the timeline more than anything else. William's own accession to the throne. Right now, King Charles remains the reigning monarch. None of what we've discussed, the Edinburgh title, the Princess Royal question, any reshuffling of titles for George, Charlotte, or Louis, can formally happen until William becomes king. That's simply how the mechanism works. When Charles ascended in September 2022, following Queen Elizabeth's death, William became Prince of Wales the very next day, and Catherine became Princess of Wales for the first time since Diana held that title before her death in 1997. That transition happened almost instantly, a single procedural moment following a change in monarch, decided and announced within about 24 hours. The children's titles are expected to follow a broadly similar logic whenever William eventually becomes king. He'll be crowned, he'll choose his regnal name, and at some point in that same window, he'll need to decide what titles to bestow on George, Charlotte, and Louis, whether immediately, or, as some reports suggest, whether to wait until they're a little older and the moment feels right. That decision is entirely his to make. The same way it was ultimately Charles's decision how and when to formally establish William and Catherine's own titles. It's worth remembering that William's own path through royal titles wasn't instant either, even though it can feel that way in hindsight. He and Catherine married in 2011 and were immediately created Duke and Duchess of Cambridge that same day, a title William held for over a decade, right up until his father's accession in September 2022 finally elevated him to Prince of Wales. Titles, in other words, tend to shift at very specific institutional moments, a marriage, a birthday, an accession, rather than drifting gradually. That pattern is exactly why so much of the current Charlotte speculation keeps circling back to one single future event: the day William becomes king. Nothing about her title is likely to move meaningfully before that day arrives, whenever it does. There's also a useful, very concrete comparison sitting in recent royal history that shows how automatically some title changes can happen once the right trigger occurs. When Charles became king in 2022, Prince Harry and Meghan's two children, Archie and Lilibet, automatically became entitled to be styled Prince and Princess, a change tied directly to the rules around titles for a monarch's grandchildren, and one that took effect the moment the succession changed hands, without requiring any separate announcement or ceremony. That example matters here because it shows the accession itself can be the trigger for title changes across the wider family, not just for the new monarch's own children. It's part of why so much of what's being discussed about Charlotte is really a discussion about a single future date on a calendar nobody can currently predict, William's accession, rather than anything likely to happen on its own timeline in the years before that. Here's the part that deserves real weight and not manufactured suspense. None of this changes George's position as heir, not the Edinburgh speculation, not the Princess Royal expectation, not any reshuffling around Louis. George's place in the line of succession has been fixed since the day he was born, and it remains fixed no matter what titles his siblings eventually receive. If you've seen headlines implying otherwise, implying some kind of succession shakeup, some reordering of who becomes king, that's not what any credible reporting actually says. What's being discussed is entirely about title and role, not about the crown itself. That's an important distinction to hold on to, because it's exactly the kind of nuance that gets flattened into false drama by content that doesn't much care whether it's accurate, only whether it gets clicked. So if the succession itself isn't changing, why does any of this matter enough to be worth this much careful explanation? Because titles, inside a monarchy, aren't just decoration, they're structure. They're how an institution tells the public, and tells itself, what a person's actual job is, and what's genuinely being negotiated here, quietly, slowly, years before it strictly needs to be resolved, is what job a king's sister actually has in the 21st century. That's a question the modern monarchy hasn't had much recent practice answering, and the women who've held the Princess Royal title across history show exactly how much that job has changed shape from one generation to the next. Princess Mary, who held it through most of the 20th century, spent the Second World War as Chief Controller of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, visiting military units and wartime canteens, and later became an honorary general in the British Army. Princess Victoria, who received it a generation earlier as Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, went on to become German Empress by marriage, carrying the title across borders in a way none of her successors would. Princess Louise, daughter of King Edward VII, became Duchess of Fife by marriage and held the title through the early 20th century. Princess Anne, by contrast, has built her decades in the role around an enormous and famously unglamorous volume of public engagements, taking on more royal duties most years than almost any other working member of the family, alongside decades of patronage work with charities, and even taking on a formal role as a Councillor of State, able to act on the monarch's behalf. Neither Mary nor Anne was handed a script. Both of them essentially wrote the modern meaning of the title through the accumulation of their own choices, engagement after engagement, year after year, with no fixed job description waiting for them when they started. If Charlotte eventually inherits it, she inherits not just a name, but an implicit standard, one her great-aunt has spent nearly 4 decades quietly defining through sheer consistency of service, rather than any formal rulebook. And that's where some of the broader commentary gets genuinely thoughtful, rather than just speculative. Royal watchers have pointed out that Anne and Charlotte already have what's been described as a notably warm, easy relationship, the kind that positions Anne as something like an informal model for the role, whether or not that was ever anyone's explicit plan. There's a kind of quiet handoff implied in that relationship, long before any title changes hands. It's the sort of detail that doesn't fit neatly into a 5-second headline, but it's exactly the kind of texture that makes a story like this worth understanding in full, instead of skimming in fragments. There's also a more uncomfortable layer to the commentary, and it's worth naming honestly rather than skating past it. Some observers have raised the question of whether it's appropriate to be discussing an 11-year-old's adult royal future in this much public detail at all. That's a fair question, and it's one the reporting itself doesn't fully resolve. Royal children have historically had very little say in the roles eventually built around them. That's simply the nature of a hereditary institution. And the pattern of the public and press speculating about a child's adult destiny years before she can meaningfully weigh in on it isn't new, but it isn't automatically comfortable either. It's part of why the palace itself, notably, has said nothing official on any of this. Silence, in this specific case, might not be evasiveness. It might be a fairly reasonable instinct to let a child actually be a child a little longer before turning her into a permanent subject of institutional planning. It's also worth acknowledging, plainly, that royal commentary in recent years has spent a lot of time discussing what's sometimes called the dynamic between an heir and the siblings who aren't first in line, the tension that can build when one child's path is fixed early and publicly, while others are left to find their own sense of purpose within the same institution. That conversation has been shaped, in no small part, by public accounts from within the family itself about how isolating that experience can be. Whether or not that's part of what's motivating the current title discussions, it's a reasonable backdrop for understanding why some royal watchers see this moment as more significant than a simple naming exercise, giving George's sister an early, clearly defined path, rather than leaving her role to be improvised later, the way Anne's own modern version of the Princess Royal title effectively was, could plausibly be read as an attempt to avoid a similar dynamic taking hold in this generation. That's informed speculation from commentators, not a confirmed motive from the palace, and it's worth being precise about which one it is. It's worth widening the lens a little further here, because Charlotte's situation doesn't exist in isolation. It sits inside a much longer, broader conversation about how the modern monarchy treats its female members generally, a conversation that's been building for years, well before anyone was seriously discussing an 11-year-old's future title. Queen Elizabeth II's own reign was, in a strange way, defined by a title she never received, Princess Royal, blocked from her for her aunt's entire long lifetime, a reminder that even a reigning queen wasn't exempt from the same structural bottleneck now facing her great-great-granddaughter. Princess Anne's decades of visible, consistent public service were, by many accounts, a quiet argument in themselves, proof that the daughter of a monarch could define an enormously demanding, modern working role without ever being first in line for the crown. And more recently, changes to the rules around royal succession itself, adjusted so that a firstborn daughter can no longer be bypassed in favor of a younger son, have already shown that the institution is capable of updating centuries-old conventions when enough pressure and enough time accumulate. Charlotte, as it happens, was among the first to benefit directly from that succession change. Had she been born a generation or two earlier, under the old rules, a younger brother could have leapfrogged her in line to the throne, regardless of birth order. Under the modernized rules now in place, that can't happen. She keeps her place in the succession exactly as her birth order dictates, ahead of Louis, behind only George. That's a separate legal change from anything being discussed about her future title, but it's part of the same broader pattern, an institution that moves slowly, but does move, when it comes to how it treats its daughters relative to its sons. Seen against that backdrop, the current speculation about Charlotte's eventual title looks less like an isolated question about one specific 11-year-old, and more like the next entry in a longer, ongoing negotiation the monarchy has been having with itself for decades, about how much formal recognition, responsibility, and visibility to give the women in the family who will never sit on the throne, but who shape how the institution is perceived, generation after generation, all the same. Whether Charlotte ends up as Duchess of Edinburgh, Princess Royal, both in sequence, or something else no one has floated publicly yet, the underlying question being worked through is bigger than her individual case. It's whether this monarchy, heading into the middle of the century, is prepared to give its women titles that mean as much in substance as they do in name, the way Anne, through nothing but sustained effort, eventually made hers mean. If you're finding this kind of clear-eyed breakdown useful, The kind that separates verified fact from years-out speculation instead of blurring them together for a bigger headline. This is the moment to like the video and share it with someone who's already been fed the fabricated version. Because right now, somewhere, another channel has already published a thumbnail claiming this was confirmed. It wasn't. And the only way accurate versions of a story like this outcompete the fake ones is if the people who actually care about the difference help this one travel a little further than that. So where does that leave things? Honestly, once you strip away every layer of speculation dressed up as certainty. Here's the shape of it. Princess Charlotte has not received any new title. No palace has confirmed one. What exists is credible reporting pointing toward two plausible future paths. A possible Duchess of Edinburgh title once Sophie's tenure eventually ends, and a widely expected, longer-term Princess Royal title once Anne's does, with the second considered by most commentators to be the more historically significant and more likely eventual destination, given precedent stretching back nearly 4 centuries. Alongside that, there's reporting suggesting Prince Louis may not receive a title tradition would normally hand a monarch's second son, hinting that whatever the family eventually settles on for this generation may look meaningfully different from the pattern that came before it. None of this changes George's position as the future king. All of it depends on timing nobody currently controls, Anne's lifetime, Sophie's tenure, and above all, when William himself eventually becomes king. That last piece is really the whole story, if you strip away every layer of speculation dressed up as certainty. This is a monarchy quietly pre-drafting the next chapter of its own structure, years before it strictly needs to, around a child too young to have any real say in it yet, testing what a rare title given to a king's sister actually means in an era when the meaning of these roles is being asked to justify itself in ways it never quite used to have to. It's also worth stepping back and noticing what this story is not. It's not a scandal. Nobody has been accused of anything. Nobody has been sidelined against their will. Sophie continues to serve as Duchess of Edinburgh, exactly as she has since 2023, with no indication that anything about her current role is under threat. Anne continues to be, by most measures, one of the busiest working royals in the entire family, showing no signs of stepping back from a title she has spent nearly 40 years turning into something recognizably her own. And Charlotte, for her part, is still a schoolgirl who has not taken on a single official royal duty of her own, the way most royal children don't begin formal public engagements until much closer to adulthood. What's actually happening here is closer to long-range institutional planning than palace intrigue. The kind of unglamorous, patient decision-making that rarely makes for a dramatic headline, but that shapes the monarchy's next 50 years far more than any single scandal ever could. That's precisely why it's so easy for this story to get flattened into something louder and less accurate than it actually is. Palace confirms shocking new title, performs better than reports suggest a title might eventually become available, pending the lifespan of its current holder. But only one of those sentences is true, and only one of them will still be true next year, and the year after that, regardless of what happens in between. It's worth remembering what Charlotte's actual day-to-day life looks like right now, while all of this is being discussed several rooms away from her. She attends Lambrook School in Berkshire, a co-educational prep school she's gone to alongside her brothers since 2022, and by all accounts plays several sports there, including football, rugby, and gymnastics, alongside dance lessons she's kept up since she was small. Her public appearances remain limited, mostly to the same handful of fixed royal occasions most years: Christmas Day services, Easter Sunday, Trooping the Colour, and the occasional additional event like the Wimbledon Championships, or a remembrance commemoration alongside her parents. None of that has changed because of any title speculation, and none of it is likely to change for years yet. That gap between the quiet, ordinary rhythm of an actual 10 or 11-year-old school terms and sports fixtures, and the years-out institutional planning happening around her future title, is worth holding on to. It's a big part of why the palace's silence on all of this might be less about secrecy and more about simply letting one version of Charlotte's life continue for as long as possible before the other one eventually begins. Nobody knows exactly which title Charlotte will end up with. Nobody knows exactly when. Given the history of the Princess Royal title alone, a nearly 40-year wait between Elizabeth becoming Queen and Anne finally receiving it, the honest answer might be that Charlotte herself doesn't fully know either, and won't for a very long time. What's certain is only this: whenever an actual palace statement is issued, not a fabricated one, not a recycled headline dressed as news, but the real one, it will answer a question that's been quietly circulating in royal reporting for months, and it will do so on a timeline shaped less by anyone's wishes than by the simple, human fact of how long the current title holders are here. There's a certain irony worth sitting with as we close this out. A story this carefully hedged, this dependent on the lifespans and tenures of people currently very much alive and very much still working, will almost never make for the loudest headline on a given day. It doesn't have a villain. It doesn't have a betrayal. It doesn't even have a confirmed outcome. What it has, instead, is something a little rarer in this corner of the internet. An accurate picture of how a 400-year-old institution actually makes its decisions, slowly, conditionally, and almost always contingent on events nobody controls. That's not necessarily satisfying if what you came here for was a definitive answer, but it is, I'd argue, the more useful thing to actually understand, especially given how many channels are going to keep manufacturing certainty where none currently exists. The honest version of this story is that Princess Charlotte is a schoolgirl with two plausible, unconfirmed paths ahead of her, both gated behind the lives of women who show no sign of stepping aside, both ultimately decided by a king who hasn't yet taken the throne. Everything else is a headline getting ahead of the facts. If you want to be among the people who actually hear it when it happens, instead of sorting through 6 versions of a fake one first, this is exactly the kind of channel built to tell you the difference between the two. Subscribe now, so that when the real headline finally comes, whether it's next year or 20 years from now, you're not left digging through the noise to find it.